Hello, welcome. I'm Susan Ware. Now, for those of you of a certain age, and you know who you are, your introduction to the Grimké sisters likely came through Gerda Lerner's The Grimké Sisters from South Carolina, which was first published in 1967 and widely available starting in 1971 in a paperback edition as part of the Schocken Studies in the Lives of Women. And in the heady early days of women's history in the 1970s, this book turned up on many women's history syllabi, along with Lerner's Black Women in White America, which was published in 1972. Now, there's sometimes a perception, which I think is mistaken, that in the early days, the field of women's history was hostile or indifferent to biography, preferring to focus on the social history of American women. But books like Lerner's The Grimké Sisters or Catherine Kish-Sklar's Catherine Beecher, which appeared in 1973, cast doubt on that generalization. But those early biographies are now more than 40 years old. So it doesn't surprise me that new generations of scholars and writers are beginning to revisit the terrain, recognizing the path-breaking research of the original works, but asking new questions and taking the stories in new directions, to say nothing of mining new digital sources that would have been impossible when the earlier works were conceived. And I put Lucy Knight's work on the Grimké sisters in this category, a 21st century interpretation of two 19th century lives. Now, of course, Knight has already deepened and widened our understanding of another key figure in American history, Jane Addams, through two powerful biographical works: Citizen, Jane Addams and the Struggle for Democracy, which was published in 2005, which was about Addams's formative years, and Jane Addams' Spirit in Action, 2010, a full biography. Now her biographer's eye has landed on Angelina and Sarah Grimké, two sisters from South Carolina who moved far, far beyond their early lives as members of a wealthy slave-owning family to become crusaders and activists for both abolition and women's rights. And today, Knight will share with us part of that story, their anti-slavery petition campaign in Massachusetts in 1837. So, Lucy.
Thank you, Susan, very much. I'm really thrilled to be here. I am grateful to the Schlesinger Library for the invitation to speak, and to the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study for hosting this event, and for all of you for coming out. Here is a startling fact. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was thinking about writing a history of the women's rights movement in 1855. To us now, this seems very early. We know how much more history was to come. But to Stanton, who was fiercely proud of the movement's accomplishments so far, it seemed there was already enough history for a whole book. She had devised this plan, of course, only 7 years after the now famous 1848 gathering at Seneca Falls, New York. But Stanton did not want to begin her story in the year 1848. It was kind of close in the time, too. Instead, she chose 1840, the year the abolition movement split in two. The dispute, or at least one of them, was whether women, long active in their own anti-slavery groups and a few co-ed societies, could be members of the men's national organization, the American Anti-Slavery Society. Perhaps not coincidentally, 1840 was also the year that Elizabeth found herself caught up in that debate. That was the year she married Henry Stanton, a leader of the group opposing women members. Indeed, they had married just weeks after the pro-women faction took control of the National Society. Henry and his allies, furious, walked out and formed a new all-male National Society. On Elizabeth's honeymoon in London, she watched as the male delegates to the World's Anti-Slavery Convention refused to seat longtime abolitionist and American women's rights advocate Lucretia Mott and other women as delegates. Henry supported the women that day with his new bride watching, but he would soon revert to his former views. 1840 was also the year that Stanton and Mott formed a feminist friendship that would lead to Seneca Falls 8 years later. If nothing else, 1840 was the year of Elizabeth's feminist awakening. When in 1855 Stanton decided to write the history of the women's movement, she naturally turned to Mott. At her desk in Seneca Falls, which is where she lived, she laid out her plan in a letter and asked her Philadelphia friend for help. Mott replied that she would gladly help and suggested, instead of starting in 1840, Stanton should begin the book 3 years earlier, in 1837, with Sarah and Angelina Grimké's labors in Massachusetts. We don't know what Stanton thought of the suggestion, but she never wrote the book. She was too busy raising her family. And by the time her 7 children were grown, she had been working for so many years in the women's suffrage movement that she wanted to write the history of that instead. Beginning in 1881 with Susan B. Anthony and others, she published the remarkable, essential, multi-volume History of Women's Suffrage, which begins its story, after a few preliminary rumblings, in 1848 at Seneca Falls. So Stanton did not take up Mott's suggestion, but we can. The story of that summer is the story of how Massachusetts women first became political. It was indeed historic for the women of Massachusetts and for the nation. The group of Massachusetts women who started the whole thing were the members, and especially the leadership, of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. Now, the society was one of the first women's abolitionist organizations in the country, having been founded in October 1833 as a non-voting auxiliary of the all-male New England Anti-Slavery Society. Back then, the women's main responsibility was to fundraise, which they did through an annual fair where they sold handmade goods and printed pamphlets and things. When the National Society was founded 2 months later in Philadelphia, it adopted the New England Society's model of excluding women. Lucretia Mott, already an abolitionist and friends with many of the men at the meeting, not to mention married to one of them, was permitted to attend the organizing meeting at her request, but when she stood and pressed the case for women members, she was refused. Instead, the men urged women to found their own societies and do all they could for the cause. 2 weeks later, having been forcefully segregated, Mott and others reluctantly formed the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. It was racially integrated from the beginning, as were the Men's National and New England societies. I'm sorry to report that the Boston Female Society was a laggard in this regard. But it admitted black women within a year, but only after abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison insisted. Meanwhile, in 1834, the National Anti-Slavery Society, recognizing women's usefulness, encouraged them to take on a new task, to collect women's signatures on petitions to Congress. We might suppose this idea rose out of the organization's nascent feminist leanings, but in fact, the society was being purely practical. And although the idea of women signing petitions was unusual, it was not without precedent. Women's first known collective petition was to the South Carolina legislature in 1788. A group of seamstresses in Charleston, facing loss of income from the new popularity of ready-made clothes, petitioned to increase the tax on such clothes in order to protect their livelihoods. The very next year, Congress passed and sent to the states for ratification the First Amendment to the Constitution, along with a few others, which granted the right of petition to, quote, the people. The gender neutrality of the word was significant, whether intentional or not. On the subject of petitions about slavery, Pennsylvania, under Quaker influences, was an early leader. After passing a law in 1780 to end slavery, albeit by a very gradual process, in 1790, some men from Pennsylvania, this was the group that Benjamin Franklin was president of, an abolitionist group, became the first to send a petition to Congress to end slavery nationwide. That said, the petition, instigated as it was by Benjamin Franklin, was not actually groundbreaking. It was essentially symbolic, as Franklin's biographer says, so I'm not making it up. A gesture was not really meant to be taken seriously. The first petition in earnest was sent to Congress in 1799 by a group of black Philadelphians, some of them formerly enslaved. Meanwhile, other northern states were passing laws that would end slavery at some point in the future. By 1805, all the northern states had such laws, or, in the case of Massachusetts, a court ruling. The systematic, if slow-motion extermination of slavery in the North was the abolitionists' first success, and we should keep that in mind. People forget they succeeded in the North. It freed their energies to work on a national campaign, that is, to use public opinion in Congress to reform the South. In the 1820s, men in local anti-slavery societies began submitting more federal petitions, often to end slavery in the District of Columbia. Why the District of Columbia? The Constitution's protection of state power over most matters gave the abolitionists only one opening. Congress had unquestioned authority over the District of Columbia. Therefore, the petitions, whose second purpose was to arouse Congress and thus the nation to debate slavery, were directed to that end. The first test of women's collective right to petition Congress, as opposed to state legislature, came in 1829 when prominent educator Catherine Beecher organized women already involved in the benevolent work for the Cherokee tribes to sign petitions to the national legislature opposing the Indians' removal from Georgia. She led the campaign, however, from her parlor in Hartford, Connecticut. Beecher was a traditionalist regarding women's roles, disapproving, as most women did, of the idea of women acting like men in the political arena. She did not collect signatures going door to door, give a single speech on the subject, or even associate her name with the effort. The circular she addressed to the benevolent ladies of the United States was unsigned and sent in printed form by mail to the secretaries of those societies. In Beecher's eyes, even doing that much was bold. She stated in the circular that she was not sure that female petitioners had a legal right to be heard by Congress, and even wondered if such actions might in fact be forbidden. Some in Congress did indeed mock the women's petitions as they came in, and they claimed that women were undermining the political order, but others defended their right to petition. In fact, Beecher, regardless of her timidity, had set a precedent. Lucretia Mott instigated the idea of women petitioning to end slavery. She organized the first women's anti-slavery petition to Congress the same year that Bostonian William Lloyd Garrison, who, as you may probably know, was the leader of the abolitionist movement, as he launched his newspaper, The Liberator. In December 1831, before any female anti-slavery society existed, Mott submitted a petition to Congress signed by 2,300 women calling for the end of slavery in the District of Columbia. She and her abolitionist friends submitted another in 1832. They drew inspiration from the impressive efforts of British women abolitionists who were persistently petitioning Parliament to end slavery in the colonies. At first, Garrison rejected the idea of women petitioning. This was on the grounds that they could not vote, so it didn't make sense for them to petition. But by 1833, he supported the idea, quite likely converted during one of his visits to Philadelphia by a conversation with his good friend, Lucretia Mott. Petitions from women began to proliferate. Sometimes they signed the same petition as men, but in separate columns, and more often they had their own entirely separate petitions. Initially, the American Anti-Slavery Society had not been very interested in petitioning as a strategy, but by 1835, it was strongly encouraging its auxiliaries to petition. Then in the spring of 1836, both houses of Congress, and there's a lot of, organizing abolitionist argument debate going on here that sets the stage for this, but both houses of Congress, under the domination of very fearful Southern legislators and their Northern pro-slavery allies, adopted a procedural rule popularly known as the gag rule. This rule blocked anti-slavery petitions from even being mentioned on the floor of either house. Seizing the historic moment, the abolitionists, aided by John Quincy Adams, representative from Massachusetts, doubled down on their petitioning strategy, adding the new cause of free speech to the cause of the slave. The Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society embraced the National Society's call for more petitions with enthusiasm. In July 1836, it printed up a circular, just as Beecher had done, but in this case it was addressed to the women of Massachusetts. And its authors, the Society's two corresponding secretaries, Maria Weston Chapman and Melanie Amidon, unlike Beecher, proudly signed it. Using every network they could, from the growing number of female anti-slavery societies in the state to friends and family, the Boston women sent out the printed circular with a petition form attached, asking every woman it reached to circulate it for signatures and send it back to the Society's offices at 46 Washington Street. And they did. The Massachusetts campaign was a success. By the end of the year, the state's women had sent 3,100 petitions, many more signatures, but in this case, we don't know how many signed, to Congress, twice as many as the state's men had sent in. At the root of women's achievement was their unflagging effort. In the circular, Chapman and Amidon reminded women that in their fight to deliver the slave, they should, quote, leave no energy unemployed, no righteous means untried, grudge no expense, yield no opposition, forget fatigue. And the women responded. In Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society's campaign started late. In October, it issued a circular to the women of Pennsylvania, using mail to communicate with women outside the city. Their justification for women's petitioning was firmly feminist. They asked rhetorically, will you say that women's duties lie within the hallowed precincts of home, not in the field of controversy or the halls of Congress? Indeed, to make their point stronger, they interpreted the gag rule as an attack on women's rights. Congressmen, they wrote, quote, would fain rob woman of the right to petition and the privileges of a citizen in order to silence her on the subject of ending slavery. Though the Massachusetts and Pennsylvania women's 1836 petition campaigns were different in some respects from Beecher's earlier one, they were similar in one respect. They were done mainly via the mail through existing societies and/or friendship and family networks. Meanwhile, men had another option, to send out traveling anti-slavery agents, as they were called, to speak to crowds in churches, barns, open fields about slavery. The National Anti-Slavery Society had had such agents. Today, I think we would call them itinerant grassroots organizers, since its founding. Agents organized new societies in the towns they visited and circulated petitions. Sometimes a petition campaign led to a new society, and sometimes a new society led to a petition. Able to make personal and visceral connections, agents could reach doubters and convert them to supporters. To continue expanding petition campaigns, the national group would need more agents. The 1836 campaign produced a surge of petitions to Congress. By the end of the year, and that, the gag rule's in place, but the petitions are still coming in, but they're gagged. So by the end of the year, anti-slavery petitions signed by 106,619 men and women were submitted, more than ever before sent to Congress on one subject in the admittedly short history of the nation. Meanwhile, the American Anti-Slavery Society was already preparing the petition campaign for 1837. In a circular to county anti-slavery societies all across the North, the officers announced that the goal for the coming year was to send in 10 times more signatures to Congress, 1 million signatures. It was a nice, big, round number, clearly less of a realistic goal than an inspirational one. And they tackled the agent shortage. They had begun the summer of 1836 with only 15 men working part-time for all 8 northern states. All that summer and early fall, the National Society's most gifted speaker and organizer, Theodore Weld, traveled arduously on horseback, stagecoach, wagon, and foot, and we cannot believe what traveling was like back then. And he recruited 45 more men, some white, some black, some of them to work full-time, some only seasonally. These new recruits would have to be able to rebut the doubters and opponents on their feet in the freely argumentative style of the day. Obviously, they needed training in the arguments against slavery and for abolition. A training convention was organized for November. But should women be involved? The national leadership had noticed the remarkable fact that as the 1836 petition campaign unfolded, some 2/3 of the signatures on the petitions being submitted to Congress were women's. Hiring 2 women agents seemed a good idea, even though women could still not be members of the National Society. By November 1836, when the agents, new and old, gathered in New York City for the 16-day training, 2 women agents were present. They were white Southerners Angelina and Sarah Grimké. Angelina's name was familiar to abolitionists. In the summer of 1835, William Lloyd Garrison had published in The Liberator Angelina's powerful letter to him about abolition being a cause worth dying for. The letter was remarkable for its eloquence and passion, but also because it was written by a Southern-born, formerly slave-owning woman. Angelina, now a resident of Philadelphia, wrote a few months after joining the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. Her older sister, Sarah, who also lived in the city, never joined the society, but in the summer of '36, she too became an abolitionist. She had concluded what Angelina had, that only immediate abolition, in Sarah's words, can save my country from destruction. Then Angelina became even more famous. In September 1836, the American Anti-Slavery Society published a pamphlet she had just written in which she made a powerful case to the white women of the South, urging them, somewhat amazingly, to take a stand against slavery in their own states, including petitioning state legislatures, whatever the risks. Do not be deterred, she wrote, by the oft-repeated objection that this is a political question with which we as females have nothing to do. The pamphlet documents that months before Angelina gave a single speech, she believed women had a right to embrace abolitionism, not just as a moral cause where women sort of had some authority in the eyes of men, but as a political cause. Reading it convinced the American Anti-Slavery Society's leaders to invite first Angelina and then, at her request, Sarah, to be trained and paid as agents. As for where and to whom the sisters would lecture, everyone, including themselves, assumed they would speak only in parlors of homes and only to women. This would ensure that they did not break either of the 2 taboos about women speaking. The first taboo was that women were not to address audiences with men in them, since this would cause strange men's gaze to fall upon bodies from afar, which was thought to be too sexually enticing for men to endure. Second, women were not to speak in public at large gatherings, even just to women, because then they would be acting like men. As of 1836, only 2 women had briefly and bravely broken both taboos: British radical Frances Wright and black Boston preacher and abolitionist Maria Stewart, both to widespread condemnation. The Grimké sisters also soon broke both taboos, without meaning to at first, but then willingly enough. Their very first speeches broke the second taboo. The event was promoted by handbill, having been moved to a meeting room of a church to accommodate the large crowd that they realized was going to come, a crowd of women. The sisters, initially shocked at having their names spread around New York City as public lecturers, understood why some people urged them to cancel the event, but believing that their campaign to end slavery was in service to God's will, and that was a profound conviction on their part and the real source of their courage, they refused to back down. After the first event, others followed. As they continued speaking around the city and in New Jersey, they broke the other taboo. Men often snuck into the parlors where they were speaking, because word got around. It's like, these are really interesting women. The first time it happened, Angelina wrote a friend as a way of sort of saying, I'm cool with this. And she said, I did not feel his presence at all embarrassing, and I went on just as though he were not there. Meanwhile, a correspondence had begun between the sisters and the leaders of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society. The Boston group sharing the National Society's vision for vastly more petitions, wanted to make the 1837 Massachusetts Women's Petition Campaign even bigger than the year before. Working with the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society, the Boston women decided that the women of the anti-slavery movement should gather in a convention in New York City in May to arouse enthusiasm and make plans for coordination. The Grimké sisters, still in New York City, helped organize the gathering. In May 1837, the Interracial Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women, the first national convention of women ever organized in U.S. history, convened. Here's one or two numbers. Some 200 women from 7 northern states attended. Not all of them, of course, were formal delegates. And more than 24 resolutions were adopted, including one that embraced the far-fetched goal of 1 million petition signatures. A central board to coordinate efforts was put in place, and shortly they would issue a circular saying, you know, organize yourself by county, coordinate how you pull your petitions in. So it was the grand scheme. As for the Grimké sisters, they made a big impression. They gave some of the most stirring speeches, or I should say Angelina did. She was a superb orator, and proposed some of the most controversially feminist resolutions. Lucretia Mott was there and recalled in her 1855 letter to Elizabeth Cady Stanton how fiercely one of Angelina's resolutions, which Mott had seconded, was debated. Mott quoted it a tad inaccurately from memory to Stanton. Quote, that it was time that women should move in the sphere Providence assigned her, and no longer rest satisfied in the limits which corrupt custom and perverted application of the scriptures had placed her. The conservative New York women, disagreeing, voted against the resolution, but it passed. The convention may have grown out of a commitment to the rights of enslaved men and women to freedom, but white and black women's rights were also on the agenda. The Boston Society decided to expand the Massachusetts petition campaign, and they wasted no time in signing up the nation's first female anti-slavery agents to come for the summer and fall to do some organizing in Massachusetts and maybe a few nearby cities in other states. Within 2 weeks, with approval of the leaders of the Men's National Society, the plan was set. The sisters, traveling in the eastern half of the state, where the population was concentrated, would not be limited to speaking in parlors, but were to give public lectures to women, call for the creation of female anti-slavery societies, and circulate among women anti-slavery petitions to Congress, particularly to end slavery in the District of Columbia. In June, the Boston Society issued a circular to the female anti-slavery societies of New England, asking them to support the sisters' petition campaign and giving a stirring justification for women petitioning Congress. They said, let's see, who, they asked, are the constituents of the men in Congress whom we petition? Quote, you, women of the North. Remember, the representation of our country is based on the numbers of population, irrespective of sex. Arriving in Boston in late May, Sarah and Angelina took up an arduous schedule. At first, they spoke in Boston and nearby towns like Dorchester and Weymouth and Roxbury, doing maybe 1 meeting a day, but pretty soon they were doing 2 and sometimes even 3 meetings a day. They had long since accepted men would be in their audiences. Some of the men were truly dumbfounded by the sight of women lecturing. Sarah Grimké, quoting the Bible, wrote a friend that as she cast her eyes over one audience, she could see men who sat, quote, with mouths agape and eyes astare. As the summer unfolded, the sisters began traveling in a wider arc around Boston, going as far north as Amesbury and as far south as Duxbury. Everywhere they went, the crowds turned out, some all white, some all black, some racially integrated. In Salem, they spoke to 600. In Lynn, 800. In Lowell, to 1,500. And in Newburyport, 1,800 people showed up. Mostly, the 2 women spoke in churches, though sometimes they were shut out of them by ministers who were afraid. And when they were in the churches, they would be filled to the gills. There would be people sitting in the aisles, on the stairs, in the windows. Somehow, the sisters' voices managed to carry to all ears. Angelina wrote, Our compass of voice has astonished us, for we can fill a house containing 1,000 with ease. Everywhere they went, they circulated petitions and urged those present to organize an anti-slavery society. At times they met with hostility from men and sometimes from women too. In Brookline, where there was no anti-slavery society, there was a particularly cold reception. Remembering the evening, Angelina wrote a friend that it was, quote, very hard to speak to such stony hearts, unquote. Nonetheless, as the sisters hoped, a society was organized. In Amesbury, 2 young men stood up and challenged the sisters to a debate, a challenge they accepted. They returned for 2 nights, taking down their opponents point by point, to the fascination of a packed audience of 1,000. It may have been the first gender debate in the history of the world. And there were more attacks in print. First, anti-abolitionist, and she was against the abolitionist movement, Catherine Beecher, remember her? The same person who led the anti-Cherokee removal petition campaign, published a pamphlet written in the form of letters to Angelina Grimké, in which she criticized her for speaking in public and speaking to mixed-gender audiences. And then the Congregational Ministers of Massachusetts issued their own circular attacking the sisters not by name but by action. And there was an enormous amount of debate about what the sisters were doing, and they were being attacked as women for breaking these taboos. And that's a whole other fascinating subject, which I don't have time to talk about today, but will be in my book. The 1837 Massachusetts petition campaign lasted 5 months, from June to October. To give only one example of what was achieved, consider the statistics for the women of Dorchester. In 1836, 150 women signed petitions. And in 1837, after the sisters spoke there, 325 women signed. In addition, the number of societies in the state almost doubled. There were 27 at the end of 1836. By the end of 1837, there were 47. Far more, by the way, than any other state. Strikingly, 8 of the new societies were in towns where the Grimké sisters had organized. Once again, the women beat the men of the state by a wide margin. In the period 1837-38, women's signatures were 80% of the 43,600 signatures on Massachusetts petitions to Congress. So the men were the 20%. Furthermore, not surprisingly, Massachusetts women led the women of the other northern states by a wide margin. For the entire 25th Congress, which ran from March 37 to February 39, of the anti-slavery petitions women submitted, 78% were from Massachusetts. All of this confirms that in 1837, something historic happened in this state. Between the sustained efforts of the Boston Female Anti-Slavery Society and the remarkable work of the Grimké sisters, the women of Massachusetts embraced a new place for themselves in national politics and made history, ignoring not only their lack of the vote, but their lack of standing in the public square and the firm barriers of custom that blocked their participation in civic debate. The women of Massachusetts organized themselves to press for political change. Later this week, we will have a chance to learn more about Massachusetts women's anti-slavery petitioning, as was mentioned. And these are petitions that were submitted to the state legislature that the digital launch on Friday is about. And Professor Dan Carpenter, who's here today, thank you, and you can talk to him if you are interested, is going to be launching this digital website with almost 4,000 anti-slavery and anti-segregation petitions that they found in the state archives. Now, and he and the project archivist, Nicole Toppich, and it was she who was digging around in the drawers, they discovered petitions that everyone thought, I thought, were lost. And these were petitions, included petitions that were gathered when the Grimké sisters were here and traveling around speaking. They were lost because they hadn't been cataloged, and they were in unlabeled drawers. So Nicole Toppich opened the drawers and dug around and found them. This is very exciting. So Carpenter and Toppich and their team, funded by the National Endowment of Humanities, have now cataloged and digitalized these petitions, 17th, 18th, and 19th century. And they're going to unveil these on Friday at 4 o'clock at the, is it Psy Auditorium? Psy Auditorium. And I urge you all to go. It's at the Center for Government and International Studies on Cambridge Street. And I'm Ira. And Nicole, are you here? There's Nicole. She dug them up. And I'm really honored to have you both here today. And I hope you all will think about going on Friday. The place that women's early anti-slavery petitioning holds in the broader history of women's political consciousness and the history of women's political, of the anti-slavery movement was of course known to those who participated, like Lucretia Mott, the Grimkes, and the tens of thousands of women who signed the petitions. But as time passed, the story was forgotten, starting with the next generation. Elizabeth Cady Stanton never pursued Mott's suggestion that she begin her women's rights history with this petition campaign. As for historians, throughout most of the 1950s, they took almost no interest in women's history. It was not till the 1960s that Gerda Lerner rediscovered the Massachusetts part of the story by writing her dissertation about the Grimke sisters, and then a book, as Susan mentioned, a very important, groundbreaking book. Afterwards, wanting to know more about women's anti-slavery petitioning, she did research in the National Archives, and in 1971 published an essay on what she had found that's also groundbreaking, and I drew a lot of statistics from that. But there was still much more to know. The first scholar to examine the broader story of women in politics was Susan Zeske at the University of Wisconsin. She wrote Signatures of Citizenship, Petitioning, Anti-Slavery, and Women's Political Identity. And then Professor Carpenter and a co-author, Colin D. Moore, have done a study of petitions in the anti-slavery petitions in the House of Representatives between 1833 and 1845. And among other things, they were interested to see whether the women who were at the top of the petitions ended up becoming activists and reformers later on in their careers, above and beyond their abolition work, and indeed that is what he found. So my question is, my first question, why did women embrace petitioning with such enthusiasm? And I would say because it solved a problem. Clearly, their lack of access to voting, their inability to join the political parties, and the taboo against women giving public lectures and lectures to mixed audiences silenced their political voices. Petitioning restored their political voices. It strongly appealed to women of all backgrounds who had an interest in political questions, just as it appealed to the men of disenfranchised groups. Petitioning offered women the one available means they had to participate in the legally structured side of the political process. But I have another question. Why the surge of women as petitioners in the 1830s? There are many answers to that question, and clearly one, big one, has to do with the rise of the organized abolition movement and its focus on petitioning. But here is another thought. For the first 3 decades of the new republic's life, in most states, only white men of property could vote. In a few northern states, black men of property had the vote too. Then during the 1820s, state after state granted full enfranchisement to white men, and in the North, rescinded it for property-owning black men, except in New York State, where wealthy black men kept the vote. As white men gained their full place in the nation's political democracy, the question of black men's and white and black women's exclusion hung more starkly in the air. Was it fair that in this new democracy, only one gender of one race, that is to say white men, had full political rights? As the nation developed a more vibrant political culture, it was natural for all categories of women to seize the available opportunities to be part of the new obsession, the passion for political self-expression. Sarah and Angelina Grimké's career in anti-slavery organizing would last a little less than 2 years. For complicated reasons, Angelina's marriage in May 1838 to fellow organizer Theodore Weld would mark for the sisters not just a pause from the life of itinerant organizing, which was their original intention, but a termination point. But before Angelina exited the public stage, she still had something to do in Massachusetts. With characteristic boldness, in early 1838, she used the Massachusetts Women's Petition Campaign to break another barrier to women's political participation. In February, the abolitionists, including some men from the National Society leadership, decided to submit anti-slavery petitions signed by thousands of the state's citizens to the Massachusetts state legislature. Those are the petitions that have been discovered, right? And to ask for that body in response to urge Congress to end slavery in the District of Columbia. These petitions were in addition to those sent to Congress directly, although the signatures were clearly collected at the same time. In deciding to involve the state legislature, the abolitionists were trying to do an end run around the congressional gag rule. Henry Stanton, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's future husband in 1838, would present the men's petitions. As a joke, he suggested to Angelina she present the women's. She knew it was a joke, but she didn't take it that way. Yes, she said, I agree. Angelina's speech to the committee made her the first American woman to address a legislative body. Her entire speech would end up lasting more than 6 hours and be delivered over parts of 3 days spread over several weeks. She would, at the end of the first 2 hours, she said, Mr. Chairman, I have more to say. May I come back? And twice he said yes. He was an abolitionist. And the audience was, there was probably 3,000 people there. It was in the Hall of Representatives. That is now where the Senate meets in the legislature. It was people everywhere, in the aisles, in the doorways. Yes?
Can you give us a little sort of thumbnail about the Grimké sisters, how they made this tremendous transformation? What drove that, and what that was like for them, if you know that?
Yeah, well, my book is about that, you know, as much as it is about what they then did. You know, very briefly, I mean, this is the fascinating puzzle of their early years. But they came from a very wealthy Charleston family. Their father was the Chief Justice of the state Supreme Court. Their brothers were lawyers. They would have gone into the law if they had been able to. And they had access to a fantastic library of their father's, and we know all the books in his library. So they had a profound intellectual grounding in the ideas of their times. And, you know, a lot of those ideas were retrograde, but, you know, there's always some dangerous ideas in any book. So that's sort of one explanation, is that they had a self-provided, fantastic liberal arts education in their father's library. The other piece, though, is, you know, not lots, but there were other Southern women who were as well-read as they, who never went north and became abolitionists. For them, it's complicated to explain, but we think that you either believed in slavery or you were an abolitionist, because that's how we feel. But back then, there were stages. And so the first stage is saying, gosh, I'm really sorry that that slave is being treated cruelly, but that doesn't mean you don't believe in slavery. And then the next stage is saying, I don't want to be around slavery because it's so painful to hear people whipped and clubbed and abused for no reason. I'm leaving. And they went through those two stages. So they started believing that slavery was a sin, i.e. to own a slave. That's still not an abolitionist position, right? Because being an abolitionist means you're going to go out and end slavery as an institution. And that's a political stance. So they joined the Quakers in Philadelphia because the Quakers believed slave owning was a sin, which was not the case in their Presbyterian or Episcopalian churches in Charleston. So that was their first step, but there was another series of steps to become abolitionists. Yes?
Was there any appeal, or did they entice anyone else down in South Carolina or in the South from this type of campaign that they did? Was there any women that came up?
Yeah, it's really a great question. I would love to, I mean, who knows, maybe I'll find someone, but so far nobody has found a woman from the South. There are a few men who become active in the abolitionist societies, like James Burney and a couple others who were slaveholders and then, you know, become Northern abolitionists. There was an attempt to reach the South through a pamphlet, big, massive mailing of pamphlets in 1835. And of course, the first appeal that Angelina wrote that caused them to notice her, where she was writing to the women of the South, they wanted that distributed all over the South. They couldn't get it there because the men in power were all slaveholders, and they knew the abolitionist literature was very dangerous from their point of view. And they would say, oh, it'll cause the slaves to riot. You know, well, actually, it would have converted white people, you know. But it was a very difficult thing to get their literature into the South. And in 1835, the very famous problem where a bunch of mail bags arrived in Charleston, and the postmaster who knew that there was this big campaign to get abolitionist literature into the South, recognized that these were mailbags full of that kind of thing, and he set them aside and he alerted his friends. And in the dark of night, they broke into his post office and took them away and set a bonfire and burned them. And there was all this publicity to say, this is incendiary material. And, the post offices in the South were in alliance obviously with the slave forces. So, yes?
Did the Grimké sisters' action have any impact on their own family?
Well, Angelina, it's a great question. Angelina spent a year before she moved to Philadelphia to join Sarah trying to persuade her mother to no longer be a slaveholder. And her mother refused. And you can see Angelina's pretty emphatic personality. And she just went at her mother all the time. And her mother just said, no, I live a life that requires slaves. She did succeed in getting her mother to be kinder. Her mother was a very cruel slaveholder during their childhoods, and I think that was another reason. I didn't finish saying that, I guess, that the sisters became so concerned about slaves is because their mother was very cruel. And I think she was very cold-hearted also, so they were kind of emotionally alienated from her anyway. But anyway, her mother became a born-again Christian, and that also is what happened to Sarah and Angelina. That was crucial because that was the message of, you must love all human beings equally. Now, you would think that any Christian faith would teach that, but the born-again Christians taught it a lot more emphatically than the Episcopal Church. So and that was what they felt. So they were very much more concerned about the suffering of slaves after they were born again. And their mother also went through that religious change. So she eventually was much kinder, but she never stopped owning slaves. Their brother beat his slave mercilessly one night, and Angelina recorded it all in her diary, and she went in and pleaded with him, and he was furious with her and wouldn't speak to her. So they couldn't make any headway. Yes?
I thought I read somewhere that the father had relations with slave women, and the sisters came to see some of
the children.
The enslaved children as their family.
Yeah.
Family.
Yeah, the children you're thinking of are their mulatto nephews, Francis and Archibald Grimké, and they were the sons of their brother Henry, the one who was being so violent. He took a slave mistress after his wife died, and he had 3 children, 3 boys by her. Nancy Weston was her name. And so that's where these mulatto nephews came from, not the father. There certainly were, the father's uncle had a slave mistress on the plantation. He left her a house and sheep, and, their child was provided for. So there was a tradition of slave-master relations in the Grimké households. I haven't found any evidence of the father, though it's completely possible.
And they have the Grimké name.
Well, that was the brothers, yes.
Yeah, the brothers.
Right. Yeah, they did. Well, that's because Nancy gave it to them. It's because that, she knew it was a good name. But, yeah, and these 2 young men who the sisters discovered accidentally because one of them gave a speech in a black college, historically black college, Lincoln University, where he went after the Civil War, where he finally got his freedom. And it was published in an anti-slavery paper, and the sisters said, Grimké, we think we're related. So they wrote to him and said, one of them and said, are we related? And he said, yes. So they went down, or Angelina went down to Lincoln University from Boston, where she was living then, and said, where are your aunts? What can we do for you? And they moved up to Boston. One of them went to Harvard and got a Harvard Law degree. The other one went to Princeton and got a seminary degree. And they both became major civil rights leaders in the early 20th century. Yeah, it's an amazing story. Susan?
I'll ask a question that's probably on other people's minds. What is it like to be working on a project and then have a best-selling novelist sitting on published?
Yeah, no one's brought her up yet. I learned about the book about 5 months before it came out because a friend of mine got the page proofs and sent it to me, and I went, oh! But then I sat down and got calm, and I said, no, this is very good. And indeed, it has been wonderful. I can't let myself read the book because this is, about Sarah Grimké and her slave. It's called The Invention of Wings by Sue Monk Kidd. It's been I'm sure you've heard of it. It's a big popular novel. Oprah embraced it. It's been a bestseller. I can't read the book because the way the human mind works is you can't keep track of whether you read it in a novel or you read it in an original document. I read this interesting statement recently where a scientist said, our brains have real trouble with sourcing. And I was like, yeah, because you know how you say, I can't remember where I read it? That's the problem. So I can't read it because I might absorb some of what Kid made up as being Sarah. So I have to keep all my Sarah stuff coming from history. But I know it's introduced lots of people to the Grimké story, which I'm very grateful for. And in particular, it was how I managed to get a book contract and a great new literary agent, is because they said, there's a big market. Look, there it is. I said, yes. And so they took me on. And I got a wonderful book contract, and lots of publishers were interested. So it's all thanks to Suma Kid. Yes?
With these early people, the women, were they interested in Maria Stewart's efforts?
Mariah Stewart, is how I think you're supposed to say it, yeah. Were they interested in her efforts? Yeah.
Did they know about her? She went to New York.
She went to New York.
She gave up on Boston.
We know they, well, we assume they met because there was only 200 women. She was at the May 1837 convention in New York City because she was in New York then as a teacher. They read her writings in The Liberator because Garrison published her. She spoke in Boston before the sisters got here. They must have heard about her, but I don't have any documentation for that. But we know they met since they were at the convention with her. Yes?
I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about Sarah.
Sarah, yes. Sarah is a fascinating person, and though she didn't have Angelina's oratorical gifts, she, I always think of her as the judge. Angelina was the prosecutor, right? Sarah would have been a judge, just like her dad. She had to edge herself very carefully into the abolition movement. She was converted by something that William Jay wrote, a brilliant mind, son of the famous Supreme Court Justice Jay. She didn't ever overstate the case, but she went incisively to the core of the issue with her mind. So she has a fascinating mind. She wrote letters on the equality of the sexes in 1837, and it is worth reading to this day. It needs to be brought out in a new edition. I think I better work on that. And it's not just about equal rights for American women or European women. She actually did research for women overseas and the injustices of their situation as well. And it's all about human rights. And my book's title is American Sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimké and the First Fight for Human Rights. And you might think, well, they weren't talking about human rights back then. They were. That was their term. So it's kind of not, this part of the history of the human rights movement is not known. And it's kind of dismissed by the international human rights folks who like to think that all of human rights history started after World War II. But I'm here to tell you, it was going on in the 1830s in the United States. And it was the radical left, of course, and it was abolitionists and feminists. And they were also fighting racial prejudice, which is not always known. There were plenty of racist abolitionists, no question, but the early 30s, well, some of them, the most radical, Garrison, the Grimkes, and some of the others, were working 100% on racial issues of prejudice and segregation, without any condescension, actually, which is remarkable. So, okay, well, thank you so much.